From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy on the campus of Penn State University, I'm Michael Berkman.
And I'm Chris Beam.
I'm Jenna Spinelli, and welcome to Democracy Works. This week, we are talking with two of our Penn State colleagues, Jilli Jung, who is a doctoral student in educational policy, and Maithreyi Gopalan, who is assistant professor of education and public policy. And they are the authors of a new study which looks at the effects of a mandated civic education test for high school students in many states across the country and how that translates to voter turnout. Does requiring this civics exam increase voter turnout? And spoiler alert, it doesn't. But we'll talk with Jilli and Maithreyi about that. But before we get to that, I thought it might be helpful to just take a step back and talk about why we even think about civic education in democracy in the first place.
As we've talked a number of times, the founders were nervous about popular sovereignty, about giving, so much power to people who were, who most people at the time didn't want to give power to, right? And so one of the ways that they saw as being a remedy to the problem was education, right? And so you have almost every founder that I know of talking about how education generally and education in politics and civics specifically was essential, right? And I just found this one little quote from Madison, which I think is representative. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. So I don't think that's a distinctive quote. I don't think, I really do think it's kind of representative. But, in the United States and in democracies generally, civic education is broadly understood as a way to prepare people for the burdens and privileges of sovereignty.
Yeah, I would not actually have taken this back to Madison because there was no particular discussion of public schooling among the founders. And of course, they didn't really think of the public in broad popular terms. They thought about politics as being restricted to landowning white people, and they had a very elitist view. And true, they were all highly educated, but I don't really pick up much in what I've read about the founders to say that they saw this as important for the population at large. I really trace it more to the development of public schooling in the United States, which was really in the 1800s. And public schools were set up to be controlled by their communities, not by the parents, but to be controlled by their communities. And that it was seen that one of the responsibilities of public schooling had to be to help to create, train, nurture democratic citizens. And so I would trace it more to the public school movement than I would to the founders. But, we're basically saying the same thing, I guess, which is that we think that there is reason to believe that in the past there was a belief, and there continues to be, that students needed to learn about their country and about their system of government and about what it means to be a part of a democracy.
I would just say, civic education in this regard is no different than just about any other question about the curriculum in public schools, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, in the libraries, in how do we read? What do we teach? What's the right way to teach math? I mean, every question about the curriculum is contentious. I mean, Michael, nobody knows more than you about how it's impacted science curricula.
Yes,
right?
Yeah, it's very contentious. And it comes down to fundamental questions about who should decide what students learn.
I think that's a very good segue to the Civic Education Initiative, right? It's not particularly old, like it's about 10 years old, right? Mm-hmm. And it was driven by the Foss Institute at Arizona State. Michael, do you want to say any more about that?
This civic education test that they have gotten many states to adopt is modeled either exactly or very closely on the American citizenship test. And I have to say, as I read about it, I read some articles about it, I keep coming up with sort of two possible reasons that they wanted to do this. Okay. One is a sense, and you see rhetoric around this very much so, that the sense that there's some kind of national embarrassment that when kids, or many Americans, I guess, are given the citizenship test that citizens have to take, they get much lower scores, and that this is considered a great national embarrassment. I don't fully get this because it's not like the immigrants that come to the United States are randomly selected somehow. So I always have found that comparison absolutely silly. But when you do read about this, it comes up quite a bit. The other is that there is research that's out there in the education world that having a more solid knowledge of the nuts and bolts of American government and American history and American institutions, American processes matters, that you have a higher level of engagement for it.
I mean, I think it is fair to say, as a matter of fact, they do say, right, that this is understood to be the bare minimum that students should know. This is the model that has been adopted very quickly by a number of states. And these two researchers are looking to say, is it doing what they hope it would do?
Right. Yeah, so let's go to the interview. We'll hear Jilli and Maithreyi explain their research and their findings and their methodology in a bit greater detail. Then maybe we can come back in and pick up the question of, if not this, then what? Where do we go now with this information? So let's go now to the interview. Jilli Jung and Maithreyi Gopalan, welcome to Democracy Works. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us, Jenna.
So I'm excited to talk with you about your new paper, which explores the connection between civic education and voter turnout among young people. And before we dive into the specifics of that work, I just like to talk for a minute about that connection, or the perceived connection between civic education and voter turnout. Jilli, it seems like kind of an obvious point on some levels that, of course, if you have more civic education, voter turnout will be higher. But I wonder if you could just talk a bit about where that assumption comes from and what underlies it.
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's like a kind of untested assumption that we have had for a long time. And I think it comes from like political scientists' view, educators' view, and then other citizens' view. And it's usually suggested as a solution to solve low voter turnout, because like civic education is kind of designed to prepare students as engaged citizens. And for a long time, political scientists has concern of low youth voter turnout. And then they often mention civic education as a solution to this low voter turnout. And that's the first thing we usually think of when it comes to like how to fix our low voter turnout, especially among young people. And school is a great resource where we can start with, some types of intervention to improve those type of civic participation thing. So that's the first thing that people think of. But at the same time, it's not certain that civic education actually works well to improve voting participation.
And so is the thought here that the more information people have or students have, the more confident they'll be, or the more motivated they'll be to go out and vote when they're old enough to do so?
I think that's just the traditional approach of like educators and political scientists, and a lot of them, right? So it's the traditional model for education itself. You just transfer knowledge, and somehow you hope that children just take that knowledge and then go and apply it everywhere. And I think that kind of has translated to this setup too, thinking that if we give them civic knowledge, political knowledge, and factual knowledge, it'll translate to them using it and to going and being more engaged citizens and in voting. So I think that's kind of the traditional line that people, or hypothesis people have about civic education affecting voter turnout.
Yeah. And I'm glad that your work is testing that hypothesis, at least in one specific way. And that is based on something called the Civics Education Initiative. Can you tell us what that is and what it was intended to do?
It's a state level civics test policy. It requires high school students to take or pass the exam. And the exam itself is about like basic US government, politics, and history. And questions for the test comes from the US naturalization test, which is for immigrants. So like immigrants, if they want to become like a US citizen, they have to take that test. So the policy supporters argue that it's a bare minimum that like US citizens has to have. So that's the format of the test. And like states have really kind of like various forms, like how they implemented it, but like basically they use the same set of question and answers for the test, and it is for high school students. And some states require this as a graduation requirement, so they have to take or pass this test to get high school degree. And like many states allow students to take multiple times, so it's not a high stake test, and because students also can see all questions and answers before.
Yeah. And so if I read correctly, this initiative was launched in 17 or 18 states over the course of a few years. Just as kind of a sidebar, it seems wild to me that many states implemented a new policy in such a short period of time. Did that seem kind of quick to both of you, coming from your background in education policy?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised, just like within a period of like 4 to 5 years, like close to 18 states adopted it. But I think it goes back to what Jilli mentioned just a minute ago, that was not a high stakes test. States also had power to implement it differently across these different states. This own state departments of education or the school districts kind of implemented this policy in a very, very ad hoc fashion. And those are all, I think, the reasons why this policy seemed to be widely adopted. But I think implementation varies dramatically, and that would be key in some way for us to keep an eye out on how this policy gets implemented and rolled out. And multiple states are thinking about it, including Pennsylvania, which we might talk about. But that's kind of the surprising thing about how this was quickly adopted in many states.
Yeah. Let's come back to the implementation. I don't want to bury the lead too much here about your findings from this research. To ask the question simply, did participating in the Civic Education Initiative lead to an increase in voter turnout in the states that had adopted it?
No, I mean, it's too obvious for us. I mean, like, even before us, there were many scholars who argued that this policy wouldn't work. And there are many like educators, scholars arguing that like this learning basic facts about like civics and government wouldn't increase any types of civic engagement among students. But there was like no research, empirical research on that. So that's why we look at it. And then we used like rigorous methods to see the causal effect of the policy on voter turnout. And we did a lot of like alternative method. We used a lot of alternative method to make sure our conclusion. And our conclusion is that the civics test policy did not improve young people's voter turnout, at least in a short term. We couldn't see the long-term effect because we only look at the one 2020 presidential election and one midterm election.
Post-implementation. So we do look at a 20-year panel and look at how the voting rates had changed in states that had adopted it versus not. And we can talk about the method in detail later. But in terms of the post-adoption outcomes, we only had very limited short-term outcome results. And so, yeah, in the short term, it looks like this approach does not work.
So you said you weren't surprised by that. And Jilli, you mentioned that, even before this CEI policy was rolled out, it was kind of questioned. Do you think that, is this basically just, I don't want to call it a bad policy design, but, is this a problem of the way that this particular policy was structured rather than a comment on the power of civic education as a whole to impact voter turnout?
Yes, it's just like specifically about this policy. I still do believe that civic education is super important and it's a great tool. And then it's almost like only thing that we have like as a educator to improve students' voter turnout, because like so many things come from like family background, but like we can improve things through public education. That I still believe civic education, but this policy specifically was not designed well.
So, knowing that there was this difference of opinion or this skepticism going into it, why did the people behind the Civic Education Initiative think that this might be a useful thing to do, or what were you able to find about their rationale for wanting to implement it in the first place?
I think basically their argument was that it's minimum that students should know, and it doesn't cost much. It doesn't cost much. It's not a high stake test. So, and then students take the test multiple times. So people can implement the policy without worrying too much about unintentional consequences. And I think that convinced legislators, because if it doesn't work, okay. But if it works, it's great.
Yeah, there's really no downside.
Yes, but some scholars actually concerned of negative impact of it, because we have really limited instruction time in school for civic education. Mm-hmm. And if we implement this policy, it means that students have to learn about this. And it means that it takes up some time of civic education that could be used for other more important civic related activities that might improve civic skills. Like, for example, like mock election or discussing about like interesting and important social issues. But rather than doing that, students just like learned like really basic history stuff and then memorizing answers, and it's not a good use of time. Mm-hmm. And given that we don't have much time for civic education at school, it was concerning.
In the world of limited time and instructional time in schools and opportunity costs of various other policies taking the space, there is always a downside when you adopt a policy like this if it's not designed well, in the sense that what else could you have done? What else that might have been effective could have been done? And so I think that's something that these trade-offs we should be thinking about, both policymakers, researchers, as well as practitioners, because there's always an opportunity cost when you're adopting a policy. What else are you not doing?
Can you give us a sense of how states and schools within those states implemented this test? You said it's, kind of an open book sort of thing. It's very low hanging fruit. But what did that actually look like in the classroom, to the extent that you were able to look at that information?
Yeah, that's a good question. This policy implementation varies a lot across states. So some states even doesn't require to pass the exam. Some states require students to take and pass the exam to graduate high school, but in other states, you can just take and then you don't need to pass the exam, and then you can take multiple times, but it varies across states a lot. And then some states does not even track students' record at the state level. They just let school district or school implement the policy, and they just provide some guidance. Oh, you can use these questions. You can, follow this instructor to implement the test, and you can have this. You can scoring with following this, and you can record your scores based on this. But then many states allow school districts to do whatever they want. So it kind of varies a lot across schools and across school districts.
So let's talk a bit about the research and the methodology that you use to match up these kind of different sets of data, right? On the one hand, you have the states that implemented CEI, but then you have, the voter turnout data over here, and students may go to high school in one state, but go to college in a different state. There's a lot of moving around that happens at this particular point in someone's life. So how did you attempt to reconcile those things, or how did you go about comparing these different data sources in your work?
That's a great question. We mostly relied on current population survey data, which is a nationally representative data of the US citizen. And it has self-reported voting participation information. And we used from 1996 cycle to 2020 cycle that has presidential elections. So we compared so let's talk about design itself first to understand why this method works. So let's say Pennsylvania implemented this policy in 2008, and we can compare voter turnout in 2016 to 2020. So after the policy implementation, does voter turnout has increased? We can look at that. But the problem is that it's possible that 2020 election was just really interesting election that many people go for a vote. So we cannot know that it's because of the policy or it's the election specific thing. So that's why we needed other states that did not implement the policy, but probably experienced the same 2020 election event. So that's why we need a treatment group which implement the policy, and then we need control group that did not implement the policy, and then we can compare whether this growth before and after the policy are differ. So that's our basic setup. So we aggregated and gathered all individual level voter turnout in each state across 1996 to 2020, and we use the difference in difference to see whether this change comes from policy, not other factors. And you asked a great question that what if people move around? Because our data is from 18 to 22 years old. So they already graduated high school when we captured their voting participation. And our assumption was that, okay, let's conservatively assume that they did not move, because previous research showed that people don't move a lot, and they can move within states, but across states move is quite small. So we, based on that assumption, we just linked the high school policy at state level and then 18 to 22 years old voting participation.
Can you give us a sense of some of the questions that are on the civic test? What kinds of things does it ask?
So I have two examples. First, the name of the territory the United States purchased in 1803. And the second example is that the name of the longest rivers in the United States.
Yeah, so not necessarily things that are connected to voting in any way, or the things that you mentioned at the very beginning, right? Like how to vote, why voting matters. None of those questions are on our ballot. And I could see how for a high school student, it might be difficult to make the connection between these seemingly random questions and what they're expected to do as citizens in our democracy.
Yes, and it is important to say that specific political knowledge really helps, actually. There were some previous studies find that if you give students really specific information on how to register vote, how to vote, those type of intervention helped students to go out for a vote. So specific targeted knowledge intervention helps improving voting participation. However, this just broad general political knowledge that is not related to voting participation does not help. That's the takeaway.
Yeah. And so that leads us into, what do we do next, or what follows from this? Is the civic test still on the books in the states that adopted it, and is it still growing? Is there still a push to get it into even more states?
There are other groups that are really trying to add to what we can do to implement this policy in a more effective way. So maybe changing the kinds of knowledge they get, the kinds of knowledge students get tested in these civic test policies. So we've been talking to organizations like PA Civics, where they think knowledge is just one of the three pillars to improve civic participation, right? But there's skills, but there's also actions. And so maybe they will add on other layers to this policy where students might get a more direct feeling of what civic engagement really means by, like, say, mock elections or participating in other local volunteering activities. Maybe if they add some of these other components to this test, maybe it will be useful in improving their knowledge and changing their actions. But I think adopting just the policy as is probably not a good idea.
I guess I just wondered too about like layering on the culture war aspect of this. I know that wasn't something that came up in your specific paper, but just as people who study education policy and who work with future teachers, I could see a scenario in which a school might say, well, given how much controversy there seems to be over anytime we bring up history or civics, or, maybe this test is all that we're really able to do, or we don't want to go any further because we're afraid it might make some people mad.
Education and public education in this country is constantly polarized. There are wars about everything, not just culture. Like there are reading wars. What's the best way to teach kids how to read? Are we providing them the right kinds of knowledge? What kinds of maths teaching works? What kind of math knowledge works? And so I think education across the board is just a very politically charged environment. And my hope as an educator is to promote research and other kinds of ways in which we can look at data, look at policies and effects in as nonpartisan a way as possible. And which is why I think policies like this and data like this should be broadened, and people should have access to such data to do more such analysis, to try and ask in a nonpartisan way, does it work? If this works, we would have come out and said it works, and it would have been just as, popular and picked up by some groups. But I think we should use good data and good research methods to ask in a nonpartisan way what works and what doesn't. And it's been a deeply problematic issue in very many education-related topics. And I think we're hoping that our work can encourage more researchers to come and study policies and topics like that in a dispassionate fashion as they can.
To bring things to a close here, so we are heading into an election year. What do each of you, how should educators and people who support civic education, which I would lump anyone who listens to a podcast about democracy as a supporter of civic education, what should we all be thinking about or striving to do to make sure that our young voters have the information that they need to be informed and successful in this coming election and to set them up to be lifelong voters?
I think just giving them basic information of how to vote and then how to register vote is super important. It seems very, easy and minor, but previous research showed that actually increased voter turnout and voting participation in early age impacts their lifelong voting participation pattern. So I think those small interventions that teachers can implement can have huge effect in the long term. So I would encourage teachers and principals at school to have a little session of giving really specific targeted information to students, how to vote, how to register.
If there's one takeaway from our study, it's not that civic education doesn't work, but civic test policy does not work. And we want to be really, really clear about that distinction. And I think we should rethink how we educate our kids to get them to get excited and engaged in the political process. Either side, you can decide to vote whichever side you want to go, but you want to be energized about the causes and the issues at stake in a democracy. And so civic educators already know this. Many of them, if you talk to social studies teachers, they'll be like, this study is not telling us anything new. We knew about this. We didn't think that policy is going to work. And so I think social studies educators already know this. And we want to encourage the public, the wider public, to force schools and policymakers and school districts to rethink their civic education curriculum, to move away from rote memorization and test-based approaches to engaging their students in the political process, in the debates that matter in our democracy.
Previous research mentioned that young people are fully politically motivated enough, because one critic toward young people is that they don't care about politics. That's why they don't vote. But that's not true. Previous study found that they are motivated enough, but they just don't have much experience to transform those motivation intention to real action. So I think it's important for us as a society to give them a tool and the power and non-cognitive skills to transform those motivation to real action. And that's what civic education should go for.
Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Really appreciate you having us.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting interview and really cool work being done by our colleagues up in the Ed School here at Penn State. I wanted to pick up, Jenna, from something that came up right at the end of the interview. And that was where they talked about how when they restricted this analysis, as I understood it, to basically information that's provided to students about how to vote, like where to go and where's your polling place, how to manage mail-in voting, all of this kind of thing.
How to register, where do you go?
Yeah, I'm not exactly how to register. They're very clear here that if you want, that's what increases voting. Mm-hmm. And I thought this was really quite telling and said a lot about the states that adopted this civic test as well. Because the states that adopted the civic test are not, from my analysis of it, all that particularly interested in increasing voting, because many of the states that adopted this test actually do as much as they can to make voting difficult. And so some of the states that adopted this, for example, don't even allow students to use their IDs to vote, their student IDs to vote in states that have strict voter ID laws. They make registration very difficult. You could go on and on. But there's a big analysis called the cost of voting, and where a state gets a score for how difficult they make it to vote. And states that adopted this, with a couple of exceptions, tend to be Republican-controlled trifecta states, and they tend to be states that make voting very difficult. And if you want more people to vote, what their analysis shows is that you need to give them information on how to overcome the hurdles that states set up to make voting difficult. So that's not what's happening here at all, because they understand that's the thing that makes voting difficult. So I thought, the real nugget of interesting information was at the end there. And it does make you wonder why states adopted this if their interest is really not in increasing engagement in voting, because I don't believe that it is. I think it's more to do with some notion of citizenship or something where you have a responsibility to know all of these details, every single detail that somebody trying to get citizenship would need to have.
My assumption was very different. My assumption was that because we are in an era of such controversy, and because there is despite all this controversy about what we teach in terms of civic education, there is a fairly universal notion that we should teach something about civic education. And so here comes this very basic, very bland, very uncontroversial set of criteria that the Joe Soss Institute has produced. And is that right? Joe Soss? Foss, sorry.
Foss. Joe Soss is a political scientist.
Joe Soss is a professor at Minnesota. Anyway, here comes a solution, right? And so everybody can just kind of implement this and all these issues go away. But your argument is that that's not at all what's going on. That this is a decision where we can present this curricula around civic education that has that crosses all the T's and checks all the boxes, but doesn't move any student any closer to be an actual voting citizen.
To me, this is symbolic politics. So these are states that make it as hard as possible, not all of them, but as on average, these are states that make it as difficult to vote as possible, who are now saying, look how much we want our young people to vote. We're requiring them to take this test before they get out of high school.
Yeah, I think.
But it has nothing really to do with voting. And so we shouldn't be surprised, even though these researchers know exactly what will improve voting, which is giving people the information to come up with the hurdles, to overcome the hurdles that these states are setting up.
All right, so here's what I would want to see in a civics education curriculum. I would want to see, very briefly, I would want to see them talking about controversial issues and then practicing argument, right? Practicing how you listen and how you evaluate and how you talk about these things with people who don't disagree with you.
Yeah,
that don't agree with you.
Democratic skills rather than
right. But I think that's an incredibly far more challenging thing to do. And I also just think in the current climate, there's just no way that's going to happen. It's going to be agreed to.
Yes,
and so that's where we're left. And so if that means the only thing we can do that we can plausibly get past in a red state is to say, here's how you register. Here's how you find out where you vote. Here's a website that you can go that's run by the government that'll tell you all this information. If you can't even agree to that, well, then your agenda is laid bare. I think it's just pretty much fair to say.
Yeah. Well, another way of thinking about this is that the state level is just the wrong place. And so states do set up these tests, and we know that tests affect what's taught in the classroom. So I understand why why states want to set up a test, because it's going to direct classroom instruction. Whether or not tests determine what students learn or not, I don't know that literature well enough, but it does lead teachers to teach differently. But I wonder if, some of the political heat on it could be pulled down a little bit if these kinds of decisions were being made at the local school district level rather than the state. And so different school districts could come up with all kinds of different ways of teaching democratic skills that fits their community and that fits what they want to do. Once you take it up to the state level, like with this, then you're getting right into the middle of partisan politics. And I understand school district politics have become quite controversial as well, but not everywhere, not on all things. And it's still nothing like a state capital.
And you're talking about thousands.
You're talking about 10,000, something like 10,000 school districts. So, yep.
Yeah. No, and there is evidence of that.
Laboratories of democracy.
This paper is, as you say, Michael, a very solid research agenda and presents the data really well. And the conclusions, even as a negative, are extremely important. And it's fun to talk about it from the context of political science, with a paper that's really written by educationists. Kudos to Jilli and Maithreyi. All right. Okay. So for Democracy Works, I'm Chris Beam.
I'm Michael Burton.
Thanks for listening.
Democracy Works is a collaboration between the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU Public Media. Our editors are Michael Klein, Chris Kugler, Mark Stitzer, and Clint Yoder. Editorial review by Emily Reddy. Additional production support from Andy Grant and Christine Allen. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating or review in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. Democracy Works is a member of the Democracy Group Podcast Network. Visit democracygroup.org to learn more about our podcast collective devoted to democracy, civic engagement, and civil discourse. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.